I'm Lucy O'Brien. I'm chair of the trustees of the Royal Institute of Philosophy and delighted to welcome you all here to this lovely Haberdashers' Hall for our presidential address. The Royal Institute of Philosophy was founded almost 100 years ago to, and I quote, advance the education of the public in philosophy. We've extended our activities in ways our founders could not have imagined, but that remains the core of our mission, bringing questions across the whole breadth of philosophy to the curious of every age and background and empowering them to address these questions for themselves. Among contemporary questions of urgent public concern, it's hard to think of one that doesn't have a philosophical dimension. Can there be such a thing as an ethical AI? How do we share the burdens of addressing the climate crisis equitably between present and future generations? In an area of dramatic upheavals in the world's population, are national borders defensible? Should people have more control over the timing of their own deaths? Is it defensible ever to deprive a person of their freedom? We need philosophy now as never before. But bringing philosophy to the public isn't just about applying the concepts and techniques of philosophy to pressing contemporary questions. The deep and abiding concerns of philosophy, whether with the relationship of mind and body, of words to things, of self to other, of humans to animals, of the present to the past, have stayed with us for millennia because, like literature or music or painting or carpentry, they can enhance the life of anyone with the leisure and the tools to experience, think about, and practice it. In its first year, the Royal Institute put on a programme of lectures in London, followed a year later by the foundation of its journal. Today, our journal, since 1931, called simply Philosophy, always pays to get in first, is one of the world's most widely subscribed to philosophy journals, and the London lectures remain our flagship programme. With a different theme every year, recent examples are madness and mental health, and death and meaning. They bring internationally renowned philosophers to a live audience, but also into print and to an online audience of thousands via our YouTube channel and podcast series. Around this core, we have a number of new programs and an expanded range of audiences. We've reached beyond London, funding an annual guest lecture in every capital city of the British Isles. And through our local partners program, dozens of weekly philosophical discussions take place in galleries, local philosophy clubs, and other organizations across the country. We reach school teachers and school children with our schools conference, with our second journal, Think, and our online masterclasses and teaching materials. With the generous help of the Jacobson Foundation, we fund teaching in schools, in prisons, and a graduate bursary and scholarship program, helping to create the next generation of philosophers. But in this expansion, the Royal Institute of Philosophy has kept its distinctness. When professional philosophers are under pressure to produce work for fellow specialists rather than for the public, and amidst a flood of online material which promises ideas of all sorts, but without being exercises in the discipline of real philosophy, what we do is more important than ever. Proper, actual philosophy for everyone. But the context is challenging. Thanks in part to diminished library budgets, our main income source, sales of philosophy and its supplementary volumes, is more constrained. We are energetically pursuing new sustainable sources of income, so that 100 years from now, the Royal Institute will still be advancing the education of the public in philosophy. And if anyone is interested in getting involved in that effort, please come and talk to me. It's worth remarking that at its first meeting, it wasn't only academic philosophers that were involved in founding an institute of philosophical ideas, as they first called it. Professors in a range of disciplines, from mathematics, biology, classics, literature, were there, as were, as Sidney Hooper, the driving force behind the initiative, put it, professional men and captains of industry. No less than an archbishop, a prime minister, and 4 past prime ministers were also on board. And a lawyer was our first chair. I am, of course, delighted to see so many philosophers here. However, I'm particularly delighted to have here academics from other disciplines, practitioners of law, practitioners of business, and those in civic roles. Admittedly, we haven't got Rishi, or indeed Liz, Boris, or Teresa, or David, but I think we'll manage. The Royal Institute has been very lucky to have been led by some very extraordinary people, starting off with the Earl of Balfour, up to our most recent president, Baroness Honora O'Neill. Honora embodies, as a philosopher, as an intellectual, as a participant in public life, everything the Institute aims to be. She started her academic career at Barnard College in New York. She moved back to the UK in 1977 to the University of Essex, where she was professor. She produced extraordinary and highly influential work in the history of philosophy and in both more theoretical and more applied political, social, and moral philosophy. Honora moved to Newnham as principal in 1992, and she's been president of the British Philosophical Association and president of the British Academy. She chaired the Nuffield Foundation and the Equality and Human Rights Commission. She has won the Holberg and the Berggruen prizes. As the citation of the former stated, O'Neill is a true citizen philosopher. And I want to take this chance to thank her for all the work she's done leading us wisely and judiciously. So if we could thank... And now to another citizen philosopher. Our new president, Professor Jonathan Wolff, is the Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government. Before moving to Oxford, he was Professor of Philosophy and Dean of Arts and Humanities at UCL, aka my boss, repeatedly. He is a Fellow of the British Academy. Joe has also forged a career that's combined academic and civic service with philosophical work of excellence and influence. He's done work for many public and charity bodies, including the Nuffield Foundation of Bioethics, the Academy of Medical Science, the Gambling Review Body, the Homicide Review Group, the BMA, and the Responsible Gambling Trust. He's co-chaired a World Health Organization working group, and for many years he wrote a regular column on higher education for The Guardian. Joe has worked on questions of inequality, disadvantage, and social justice. He works on applied topics such as public safety, disability, gambling, and the regulation of recreational drugs. His book, Disadvantage, co-authored with Avner Deschalette, who we're delighted to have here, has been highly influential both within and without academia. Joe also seeks to bring political philosophy and philosophers to a wider audience by writing introductions to Marx, to Nozick. His book, An Introduction to Political Philosophy, is on its 4th edition. Joe is now working on questions of belonging, nationalism, and civil society, and has a recent book, City of Equals, also co-authored with Deschalette. We are very, very pleased that he agreed to our invitation to become the president of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. His address today, appropriately for this occasion, is called The Value of Ceremony. And so I'll shut up and let him get on.
Well, thank you so much for that amazingly kind, overkind introduction, Lucy. And it is, to recycle a cliche, such an honor and privilege to take on this role as president of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, which, as Lucy said, is the most public-facing of the National British Philosophy Societies. From its foundation, the Institute was determined to include the public, not only as an audience, but also participants in its activities. And I'm delighted that it's continuing to expand the role. My predecessors as presidents all lived that idea in their work and their writing, that philosophy is not merely an academic discipline and doesn't only take place in universities, although, of course, that is very important. I've often thought of myself as a member of the Guild of Import-Export Dealers for Philosophy. And it's clear that the Royal Institute of Philosophy is the right trade association for me. And the Haberdashers' Hall the right place to be giving this address, not only because of the association with trade, but one of my grandfathers was a haberdasher's merchant peddling buttons and ribbons. So it feels in a way a bit like home for me. Like Lucy, I'd also like to acknowledge and pay tribute to Honora. Honora, I began reading her works, your works, as an undergraduate. And we first met when Honora was the external examiner for my MPhil at UCL in 1985. And Honora has supported me in numerous ways ever since, including, I don't know for certain, writing a reference for me for my current job. So I'm very grateful in so many ways. But my topic this evening, and an appropriate one I hope, is the value of ceremonies. I'm going to start in what might seem an unlikely place, which is a remarkable book by Collins, Murdoch, and others called Portfolios of the Poor. And this is a book in which the authors tried to work out how it was possible that so many people, hundreds of millions of people around the world, live on $2 a day purchasing power parity. So that is, they live on what you can buy for $2 a day in the United States. The authors were particularly interested in the sophisticated, informal financial instruments people were using. And their methodology was one of financial diaries. So they gave all their participants a diary to record every transaction in and out, to trace what they were doing. It was fascinating to see that many people took out short-term expensive loans at the same time having money. And you think, well, why do they do that? And you think, well, actually, that's what I do too. Have credit cards and savings. So why is that? So the type of complex, sophisticated instruments people used to manage their money was fascinating. But what I was particularly interested in was that it turned out to be not too hard to live on $2 a day in stable times. And that must be so because there are hundreds of millions of people around the world that do it. But what was problematic for people, well, one of the several things, was unexpected expenses. Now, they studied poor families in South Africa, in Bangladesh, and India. And there were three types of events that derailed people's finances. So the first one was unexpected medical expenses, which is no doubt universal. But the other, in South Africa, was the vast expense of funerals, and in India and Bangladesh, weddings. And people were spending up to half of their annual income on a wedding or a funeral. And these are among the poorest people in the world. Even the poor host elaborate weddings. They go into debt. Sometimes they go into debt for the rest of their lives to host the right type of ceremony. So it's very interesting to judge your own reaction to that fact. I'm not going to do a survey of what people think about it yet, but we might come back to what we think about this. Now, fascinating though these facts are, you might wonder what they're doing in a philosophy paper. But maybe the answer is already obvious. Ceremonies such as weddings and funerals are so important in the lives of a great many human communities that people go to enormous expense and trouble to host them. One reason that funerals in South Africa are so expensive is that people are expected to put on more or less a continuous celebration, commemoration for days for an extended family. So people are taking time out of their lives to come and mourn a friend, neighbor, a family member. People will sacrifice a lot. And I think we conclude, just to put it very blandly, that there's a connection between ceremonies, or many ceremonies, and what human beings value. I'll develop that in more detail, but I think this is enough to see there's at least a prima facie reason for thinking about why are ceremonies treated the way they are. Now, this is the Royal Institute of Philosophy, so you will already be asking, what do I mean by ceremony? And if this was the 1950s, that would be all I would be talking about. But it isn't. So I will be quite brief about this. But there are two terms that I will be using a lot, ritual and ceremony, and sometimes I'll treat them as close to interchangeable. But I do think there is a difference, or there can be a difference. So I think of ritual as a repeating pattern. Ceremonies don't need to repeat. As far as I know, this is the first presidential address of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, not the last, I hope. But it is a ceremony, even though it's not repeating. However, if things do repeat, fall into a pattern, in a sense they become stronger. But we also use ritual in a type of dead metaphor sense, where individuals can have rituals. So I was reading quite a lot about Rafa Nadal's ritual before he serves a tennis ball. And we can use ritual in that sense of repeating behavior without it having the type of sense of celebration that goes with ceremony more often. So I'm interested in elaborate collective celebrations, and so I'll mostly talk about ceremony, but much of what I say will also apply to other forms of behavior, including many rituals, and there are many other terms, rites, possibly customs and traditions, and associated phenomena including marches, processions, pilgrimages, political rallies, which I'll come back to, and perhaps even myths, taboos, magic, and symbolism. To include all of these would be to cast the net very wide, so mostly I'm going to be talking just about ceremonies in a particular sense. So what is that sense? Well, first of all, ceremonies for me are collective. They involve a broader population than just rituals. Secondly, they are out of the ordinary in the sense that they take us out of normal routine. The folklorist who I'll return to, Van Gennep, called this a liminal space. So ceremonies can take us into a liminal space, which isn't part of normal time. The anthropologist Victor Turner introduced, I think, a third aspect of my account, which is that they involve social drama. There's some dramatic nature to it. And fourthly, they go beyond their narrow practical function. It just occurred to me on my way over here, another way of putting this point is that ceremonies are a fuss. that there's more to them than you need to achieve the objects. And those who don't like making a fuss don't like ceremonies, I think. There's a further feature, I'm not sure what to think about this, but I'll just mention it as I find it fascinating. One commentator said, rituals never fail to provide commentaries on what kind of action they are or on what they may achieve. So rituals are almost essentially reflected on forms of activity. They're strange. We want to understand them. So, who are the philosophers who have talked about ceremony? Clearly, anthropology, sociology, folklore academics pay a huge amount of attention to ceremonies and rituals, and I'll return to this, but where in philosophy do we turn to analysis? Well, ancient Chinese philosophy is the obvious reference point. And to a Western reader, one of the striking factors of Confucius, for example, is his reverence for ritual. Rituals are taken as central to life. They're a constant reference point with their value widely acknowledged. Rituals are linked to the sacred, to a sense of respect for tradition, the past, and one's forebears. But they are sometimes criticized, and there are questions about whether some are too elaborate or too costly or otherwise objectionable that I will come to. But comparing Chinese to Greek philosophy is interesting in this respect. And what I say is very provisional, based on less than mastery of the subject. But where, even in ancient Greek philosophy, do we find ceremony or ritual? Well, at the beginning of Book 1 of the Republic, we have the elderly Cephalus as depicted as sitting garlanded in a chair. And to many people, that sort of brings to mind a sort of Monty Python thing. Now, there he is sitting garlanded in his chair. And then when the argument gets a bit difficult, he makes the apology that he has to leave because he's got to return to court to supervise the sacrifices. So he leaves to take part in a sacrifice. Plato's Symposium takes place as a feast, and there is a discussion of ritual at the start. They discuss which drinking ritual they should adopt of the many choices, and they adopt the very sensible ritual that allows people to drink just what they want that night, because they had a heavy night the night before, and they don't want to be forced to drink too much if they don't want it. And then ritual disappears. For Aristotle, I haven't found any mention of ceremony at all. Tell me, whenever I say that, someone should say, you should just look harder. You should just look harder. So I want you to do the looking for me and tell me what I'm missing here. The Pythagoreans were reputed to have held various rituals, but that was, by commentators, distilled off, or the other way around, their mathematical and philosophical work was distilled off from their ritual behavior, just as with Newton, his physics was distilled from his alchemy. So who in the later Western tradition is the philosopher of ceremony? Well, even in the modern world, I've found relatively little. Hume has an essay of superstition and enthusiasm, and he links ceremony to superstitious religion, which he bitterly opposes, and seems to prefer enthusiasm, which he thinks will burn itself out eventually and turn into something like the Quakers, which he admires. Spinoza, earlier on, devoted a part of a chapter of his book, Theological Political Treatise, to the topic on the reason why ceremonies were instituted. I mean, this book is rarely read now, I think, although Jonathan Israel claims that it's one of the most profoundly influential philosophical texts in the history of Western thought, which surprised me to read it, I must say. But primarily, it's because Spinoza had the courage to question the authorship of the Old Testament. And so that's what made the book so notorious. It hasn't really come down to us as part of standard canon other than for specialists. But Spinoza has a particular line he wants to take, which is to say ceremonies are not part of the divine law because they're contingent. They vary from place to place. Some societies have them, some don't. Therefore, they're not part of the universal law. And he also repeats several times, I don't know why he's so concerned about this, but ceremonies do nothing to advance human happiness, he says, which he connects to the universal law. So where else? Well, several philosophers have briefly acknowledged the pragmatic value of festivals and celebrations, as Machiavelli puts it in The Prince. But a more sustained discussion comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And the philosopher Howard Williams gave me this reference. When I did this thing, no one's written about ceremony. What about Rousseau? He said. Well, it's in Rousseau's constitutional writings on Poland, so one of his latest works, last works. And he's explicit about the function of ceremonies. He agrees with Spinoza about the contingency of them, and in proposing new constitutional terms for Poland, Rousseau wishes to harness the potent power of ceremonies for political purposes. So Rousseau writes, "How then is it possible to move the hearts of men and to make them love the fatherland and its laws? Dare I say it, through children's games, through institutions which seem idle and frivolous to superficial men, but which form cherished habits and invincible attachments." He gives the example of bullfighting, which he says has contributed no little to the maintenance of a certain vigor within the Spanish nation. And so he wants to introduce new ceremonies to bind the community together, noting it's hard to believe to what an extent the heart of the people follow its eyes and how much it is impressed by majestic ceremonials. But there is a hint of Spinoza in Rousseau when even Rousseau says that Moses overburdened his people with peculiar rites and ceremonies. So you can go too far. Now, Rousseau is so often the exception to any generalization one would wish to make about Western moral and political philosophy. And in general, the tradition seems to have had much greater sympathy with Spinoza and Hume regarding ritual and ceremony as a type of remnant of primitive superstition and to be put along astrology as an early attempt to explain and control the world, and we should rise above that. And of course, if one reads, say, Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough or similar works, it's easy to get the impression that the main point of ceremonies is to try to control the world using mistaken theories of causation. But that fails to explain the persistence of at least some into the modern age. And in fact, the most substantial discussion I've yet come across is Wittgenstein's notes on Sir James Fraser. Now, these are rather short, maybe 20 pages, extracted from longer notes and compiled by others. But Wittgenstein takes exception to Fraser's attempt to explain or reduce or unmask rituals. I mean, you could put Wittgenstein's position this way. Fraser wants to explain ceremonies away. He wants to see through them. Whereas Wittgenstein wants to understand them as they are. And he says, Fraser's explanation of primitive practices are much cruder than the meaning of these practices themselves. And he goes on to say, Wittgenstein goes on to say, one could almost say that man is a ceremonial animal. This is probably partly false, partly nonsensical, but there's also some truth to it. And some commentators have seen in these notes on Sir James Fraser some elements that then form the major part of Wittgenstein's later writing. So the idea of a form of life would be the key example. Well, again, I'm going to leave that to others, but Wittgenstein does want to emphasize the continuity between ceremony and ordinary life. So, for example, he gives the example of hitting a tree or the ground with his cane when he's angry. And he doesn't think he's punishing anything, but he's expressing his anger through that ritual behavior. But I want to resist this idea of reducing ceremonies to a type of ordinary form of life because the social drama disappears and the liminal space aspect of it disappears too. So I want to say maybe there's a continuum, but I want to reserve this special notion of ceremonies. So who are the contemporary philosophers of ceremony? Well, so far, and I'm still looking, I found just 3 philosophers who treated ceremony with any seriousness or at any length. And I will draw on all of them in developing my own view. The first is Richard Wollheim, who by coincidence is who Lucy's chair at UCL is named after. Lucy is the Richard Wollheim Professor of Philosophy at UCL. And the first philosophy lecture I ever went to was by Richard Wollheim, so it's a nice circle here. Wollheim wrote a paper called The Sheep and the Ceremony, and it starts with an example taken from Confucius, in which Wollheim puts it, Tzu Kung, one of the disciples, asks about the monthly ceremony at which the new moon is announced to the ancestors. Would it not be better, he queries, if the practice of sacrificing a sheep were done away with. Confucius reproves him gently. He calls him by his familiar name, Tzu. He says, "You care for the sheep, I care for the ceremony." So this is in Confucius. So Wolff sensitively describes the role of ceremony and ritual in human life. I'll read out another quote, slightly longer. "The ceremony of announcing the new moon may be used to represent a whole class of actions without which human life would be very different, both from what it is and what we may presume it to have been throughout culture. They are felt to be obligatory, though not necessarily unconditionally so, and certainly not by all. They admit of being done well or being done badly, or at any rate, being variably done. They, like all actions, have consequences, but they are not done for, nor do they derive value from those consequences. The value they have is best thought of their capacity to give value or meaning to a life, to the life, that is, of the person who performs them." So Wolff then connects ceremony to value in life or the meaning it can give to a life. I'll come back to that at the end. Now, the second contribution is from the philosopher John Kekes. So Wolff regarded himself as a lifelong socialist. Kekes is known as a philosophical defender of conservatism. And just to establish that point, he's written 2 books, both roughly called The Defense of Conservatism. Kekes does draw on Wolff, but he makes a strong case for the value of ceremony, suggesting, first of all, that ceremonies weld the community together, they allow people to share each other's fortunes, and they create a link with the past. And he goes on to say, if a ceremony does mark a significant occasion in a life-enhancing way, it fulfills 3 crucially important functions. It directs the expression of natural sentiments evoked by the event, it unites a community, and it acts as a bulwark defending civilized life from barbarism, he says. Now, all 3 functions link ceremony and conservatism, but it's the last, a bulwark defending civilized life from barbarism, is notable, and again, I will return. So after I discovered Kekes' paper, I wanted to see what influence it had had. Well, it was written in 1987, and as far as I know, it is yet to be cited. So if this paper goes ahead, it will be Kekes' first citation for that. The third contemporary philosopher who I found discussing ceremony is Jürgen Habermas, and I owe this reference to Mark Hannum, who's sitting over there, who reviewed Habermas's recent book, 2023, also A History of Philosophy, Volume 1. Habermas, I think, is 93. To write something called Volume 1 is very impressive. And it most notably includes a chapter on myths and ritual practices. I'm going to come back to that, but once again, Habermas draws on sociologists rather than philosophers. He mentions Austin's philosophy of language, which is important, but no, he doesn't even discuss Wittgenstein, I think, as a theorist of ceremony. So why have philosophers in the Western tradition paid so little attention to ceremonies? Well, anything we say has to be speculative, but one thing to notice is the extraordinary personal lives of the great philosophers in the Western tradition. So it's often been pointed out that prior to the 20th century, almost none of the philosophers that we read today had what we might think of as an ordinary family life. Very few married, very, very few were responsible for the upbringing and education of children. What's less often observed, and I need to look into this further, is that many didn't even have a normal family life as children, being sent from home early for their education or to live with wealthy relatives. So as far as I can see, in the biographies of the great philosophers, almost none were at the center of ceremonies. They didn't organize weddings, funerals, christenings, or other rites of passage as part of their lives. They did have to contemplate their own death, of course, and there's quite a bit of reflection on death. Not so much on funerals, as far as I know, though there may be something there. Now, a separate, though quite possibly related argument concerns the nature of philosophy in at least a significant part of the Western tradition. And this is brought about by a comment on Voltaire by French novelist and biographer André Marot that I just came about completely by chance. So Voltaire's great weakness as a historian, he says, is that being an intellectualist philosopher, he doesn't understand the sentiments and mystical cravings of other men. He does not perceive that underneath the multiplicity of sects and rites, there's always the common ground of a need for rights. A similar point can be made by combining two other quotations. Emil Durkheim noted that the religious rites are a manner of acting which take rise in the midst of assembled groups and which are destined to excite, maintain, or recreate certain mental states in these groups. And Raymond Aron makes the obvious point, there's a great philosophical tradition according to which authentic liberty is the mastery of reason or will over the passions. So the thought here is that ceremonies are the realm of the passions. They're not the realm of reason. And our job as philosophers is to overcome that. Perhaps most clearly associated with the Kantian view. That may not be everyone's interpretation of Kant, but we will maybe see later on. But the degree to which rituals involve exciting the emotions, there'll be of deep suspicion. And I can't resist reading a more general antipathy, which is beautifully put in an essay on the idea of home by the Holocaust survivor Jean Amery in a book called At the Mind's Limits. And Amery says, I am not an old general. I do not dream of national grandeur. I do not find in my family album any army officers and high-ranking civil servants. Also, I have a deep aversion to riflemen's gatherings, choral celebrations, and festivals of national costumes. I am, in general, precisely what in Germany, not all too long ago, would have been called an egghead. So, eggheads are opposed to fuss. They're opposed to ceremony. And are you an egghead or not? Now, while philosophers have been very quiet about ceremony, it's the stuff of life for sociology and anthropology. If I was to do a literary review of the use of ceremony in sociology and anthropology, and also psychology, psychoanalysis, I would never stop. But there are some important contributions I just want to touch on. So it came as a great surprise to me that the term rites of passage comes from a 1909 book by folklorist Arnold van Gennep, who I mentioned before, and it wasn't available in English until 1960. So it seems that that phrase, rites of passage, wasn't available to us until the 60s. Now, the subtitle to the original French version has been translated as Systematic Study of the Rites of the Doorway and the Threshold of Hospitality, Adoption, Pregnancy, Delivery, Birth, Childhood, Puberty, Initiation, Ordination, Coronation, Engagement, and Marriage, Funeral, the Seasons, etc. Okay. So, in other words, wherever we look, there are rites, according to Van Gennep. Many will be too trivial to call ceremonies, but others clearly are of great importance. Religious rituals, harvest festivals, and of course, birth, deaths, marriages, ceremonies of reaching the end of childhood, and so on. John Kekes made a similar point. He says that almost all societies celebrate the same core events. They celebrate others, but they all celebrate the same core events. Birth, the passage from childhood to maturity, marriage, old age and death, achieving conspicuous success, displaying extraordinary vice or virtue, recovering from a serious illness, the return after a long absence. So all of these are celebrated. But the mention of extraordinary vice reminds us of the important point that ceremonies can be negative in intent, such as public executions. And more sinister is the possibility that they can create a type of false value through ideological use, and I will come back to that. It's already latent in Rousseau's proposed co-option of ceremonies for political purposes. So I've been building up a picture in which instead of seeing ceremonies and rituals as an embarrassment or superstition that human beings should overcome, they instead have some connection, not yet specified, with value. As a preliminary to saying more about that value, I want to turn to recent studies that have drawn on neuroscience to monitor the physiological effects of engagement in ceremonies, either as participants or spectators, to support speculations about their effects. And one helpful compendium is a book by Dimitris Xygalatas, a 2022 book, Ritual, which summarizes many findings in neuroscience, some of which are his own. What he's interested in is why human beings engage in activities which they find deeply meaningful, even when their purpose is very obscure. And he says that Durkheim is right. The performance of collective ceremonies allow people to set their everyday worries aside and be transported, albeit temporarily, to a different state. So Xygalatas is particularly interested in trying to understand the nature of that transformed state. So he and others put heartbeat monitors on people engaging in extreme rituals. He's particularly interested in fire walking, for example, but not only fire walking, participants, spectators, and others around. And he noted the intense physiological effects it had, not only taking part in ceremonies, but participating, watching, and sort of synchronized heartbeats, very, very elevated states. And through these states, he says, people come together and find themselves with a sense of connection and unity, and they mark key moments in our life that gives a sense of accomplishment and growth. The chapter titles give an excellent summary of the mechanisms he identifies. I'll just list them: order, glue, effervescence, superglue, that's what you get from fire walking, sacrifice, and well-being. Now, his work is often on rituals that don't have any clear meaning. I mean, this is one of the mysterious things for him, that people are fire walking, they can't tell you why, other than that's what we do around here. And we would feel terrible if we didn't do it. So he's interested in ritual just for the sake of ritual. But I'm also interested in thinking about the value of ritual and ceremonies in another way, which is very well expressed by an anthropologist, Monica Wilson. And she says rituals reveal values at their deepest level. Men express in ritual what moves them most, and since the form of expression is conventionalized and obligatory, it's the values of the group that are revealed. I see in the study of rituals the key to an understanding of the essential constitution of human societies. So what interests me is that ceremonies are a type of epistemology of value for the community. So what the community chooses to celebrate is clearly going to be very valuable. Time stops to celebrate these moments. People pay a lot of money, a lot of time, pay a lot of attention. So to return to portfolios of the poor, what is so striking, of course, is that an elaborate wedding or funeral wasn't considered a luxury or an indulgence, but something expected of people even when they had very little and they had to get into punishing debt. But we can also see why a type of rationalist philosophy, the eggheads, are so appalled at this. That what sense does it make to go into debt for the rest of your life just to mark a marriage or a death? But the fact that people are prepared to do that and are expected to do it shows the level of importance these events have. Now, I want to particularly keep a distinction between the two sources of value in mind. First of all, there is the type of neuroscience of ritual and ceremony that talks about the value of ceremony in general. And they give people a sense of excitement of the emotions. Whatever the content is, the ceremony can have that effect. But also there's the value that the particular details of the ceremony reveal. So a marriage ceremony is different to a funeral, which is different from a graduation ceremony, which is different to a presidential address. So all of these things have their particular content, and the fact that we wish to celebrate them through a ceremony shows that they are of value, at least to that group. Now, I think we get a much more powerful picture if we put the two together, the general force and the particular content. And here I'm inspired by some comments of Habermas, though I won't follow them. So Habermas is particularly interested in the sorts of ceremonies that the philosopher of language J.L. Austin discussed, such as wedding ceremonies, where in the right context, just saying something like "I do" can have the most powerful consequences. So Habermas says some ceremonies have minimal propositional content, you say almost nothing, with an overwhelming illocutionary power, i.e. they have very significant consequences. And he says if they're said on the right occasion, there's something about the framework that trigger stereotypical feelings and evaluative attitudes and create social bonds. So that the content of the ceremony is given a type of halo effect by the fact it is being validated in a ceremony. So you could try to defend the value of something in human life by writing a paper in the journals. That might not have much emotional effect. You could try to validate the value through a ceremony, and if you do it right, then you'll have a great power around that. So ceremonies give a type of extra force to the values that they're celebrating. Death takes on a greater significance in the context of a funeral, and a partnership between two people in the context of a wedding. Ceremonies introduce significance, bonding, and loyalty, irrespective of the content, but at the same time they give extra force to that content. And I think this is what Kiki's meant when he said that ceremonies act as a bulwark, I might say that correctly one day, defending civilized life from barbarism. What he means, I think, is that ceremonies have the sociological function of reminding us what we think are important. So it defends it from a type of criticism. It defends the values from being lost at times of great stress, say. So in times of famine, in times of civil war, we might think certain things are not important. Ceremonies brings back to us that even in these times of stress, our values are very important. But at the same time, we can see why progressives are very suspicious of ceremonies, because they, to put it in Nietzschean terms, they sort of foreclose the revaluation of values. They enshrine the values that we've got and the values that we want to put into those ceremonies. So in that way, they are conservative. The grave danger, I think, is when ceremony is used to support values or defend a message that would not stand up to calm, rational scrutiny. So this is something we see in political rallies very often. So what political rallies do is exploit the neurophysiology of ceremonies to supercharge a political message to a point where it becomes very difficult for anyone to question that message because it's imbued with loyalty and the other aspects that a ceremony brings with it. Now, I said ceremonies can be used for progressive values, they can be used for revolutionary values, they sometimes are. But even there, the egghead or the rationalist will be worried about this, that the revolutionary values should be defended because they're right, not because they are defended at a political rally. So there are several ways then that we might criticize ceremonies. One is the most obvious one, that they're a big fuss, as I said. They use a lot of resources. Just think how much this is costing tonight. What could we have done with all of this money? It could have been used much better, according to some people. The other objection, and I won't apply it to my own case, is that you object to the thing that is being celebrated. So it's not so much that it's a waste of money, but we just shouldn't be validating that thing. So you can imagine two different criticisms of weddings. One is it's costly, and two, it's a bourgeois institution. Marriage is a bourgeois institution, which is a completely different criticism, though typically they might well go together. Now, I set out defending the value of ceremonies. You might think I've changed my mind now, and pointing out the great danger because they can be used in this adverse way. And nothing in life is all good, of course, that things can be good and have dangers, and we need to be aware of those dangers. What attitude should we have? So you might think that on the basis of what I've said and what people like Spinoza and Hume said, what we should do is try to talk people out of ceremonies. Now, I've got 3 reasons, maybe 4 reasons, why I think that is not the right conclusion to draw. The first one is that if philosophers declare war on ceremonies, we know who's going to lose that war. Okay? So we're not going to be able to wish ceremonies away by writing papers, even in our own journal. I don't think we have that power. But more importantly, perhaps, I want to draw a comparison with a move in contemporary political philosophy based on a distinction between what's typically called ideal and non-ideal theory, although I prefer the term real-world theory rather than non-ideal theory. So we have a contrast between ideal theory, building an idea of the just society, and real-world theory, which tries to start from where we are, understanding the injustices in the world as it is, and try to work out ways that we as philosophers could help make the world as it is a better place, rather than thinking our job is to come up with models of the best, and it's for other people to do the work on improvement. Now, moral philosophy hasn't quite made that distinction, I don't think, although it probably is in there. But I would say that if we're going to take human life seriously, then we need to do real-world moral philosophy, which means starting from what people actually value and trying to understand why they value it, and maybe thinking of alternatives or capturing the good and eliminating the bad, rather than thinking, don't start from there. Right? So a type of real-world moral philosophy, and Richard Wollheim has an expression for this, although he doesn't use it the same way, but I will co-opt it. He says, there's a well-worn phrase, you must take him as you find him. I would adapt the phrase and say to moral philosophy, you should take morality as you find it. So morality as we find it is full of ritual and ceremony, and we need to understand that. Secondly, there's a possibility that ceremonies can help us develop better philosophical accounts of what gives meaning or value to a life. Now, I'm not saying that only ceremony can do this, but this was Wollheim's reason for looking at ceremony. He develops it in his own way. But in contemporary political philosophy, or moral philosophy rather, one of the influential accounts is from the American philosopher Susan Wolff, no relation, different spelling, who has come up with a view which may seem rather obvious, that a meaningful life is where subjective attraction meets objective attractiveness. That is, you need to be engaged in things that are of objective value. Great, every reader says. What do you mean by objective value? Well, she gives us examples, some of which are actually contestable. And she at no point gives us a definition of objective value, and how could she? Because what would that really be? But ceremonies give us a type of epistemology of collective value, even if not objective value. And we can understand people who want to frame their life around the things that are celebrated in ceremonies. That will be one account, not the only account, of what a meaningful life could be. Finally, and the reason why I've started on this in the first place is in connection with thinking about nationalism and alternatives to nationalism. So one thing I've been very struck by is a paragraph in a paper by Brian Barry where he talks about self-government. And it's a very eloquent paragraph, but the bit that stuck out to me was that in contemporary political philosophy, nationalism had been considered by the great political philosophers, and another word I can never get right, inimical to civilized values. Nationalism is an affront to civilized values. That was definitely the philosophical tradition I was brought up in, that if you're a nationalist, you're a right-wing, you're a fascist, and we didn't really want to talk to you. But of course, that leaves us lost in the contemporary world where nationalism is on the rise. And there was a group of philosophers in the 1990s who tried to develop a view called liberal nationalism. People didn't take very much notice. The same philosophers had another go. Now they've all written books again called things like Why Nationalism in the aftermath of Brexit. Because there was a feeling, I think, in this country and others, that the left had abandoned nationalism to the right, and that was a bad tactical mistake. And somehow the left has to re-adopt nationalism? Well, historically, I find this a rather dark move because that was the beginning of fascism in Italy and Germany. I'm not saying we're there again, but this idea that we're on the left and we add nationalism, everything's going to be fine, seems to me a very bad move. So what I'm interested in is thinking about alternatives to nationalism, bearing in mind that a type of universal cosmopolitanism just doesn't seem to fit with human psyche. That for most people need to identify with groups that are less than the whole of the human race, maybe multiple groups. So what I'm wondering is whether we will be able to use ceremonies as finding other forms of group formation. That is, people will, of course, celebrate their family, their profession, their religion, their community, their region. In fact, many of the things that are said about nationalism are really regionalism rather than nationalism. So, there's no such thing as Italian food, there's only regional cuisine, and so on. So the idea that we could get sub-national groups and cross-national groups identified through the mechanism of ceremonies is something I want to be looking at. Now, but I would just end with, return to my first thought. People in this room may or may not find ceremonies appealing. And I have to make my own confession that, personally, I'm with the eggheads on this, and they are a lot of fuss. And you could do so much more money with that, so much more with that money. But I realize that people who think like me are not in the majority by any means, and that if we ignore ceremonies, we ignore a central component of human life, society, and culture. And that would be a strange thing to do for people who call themselves philosophers, and even stranger when they come together under the banner of something called the Royal Institute of Philosophy. So I will leave on that note, and thank you for your attention.
For that talk, and I'm very glad that you're addressing these questions. First of all, one more name to conjure with, which I mention because many in this room will remember him with great admiration, Martin Hollis. Mm-hmm. He doesn't, I can't remember a passage where he directly addresses ceremony, but he wrote a lot about the sort of functionalist anthropologists, such as Van Gennep, that you're referring to, and in particular address the philosophical question of how their explanations were supposed to work. I think that's a very good topic for a philosophical investigation into this matter. One might find some useful hints in his books. But I'm going to do something unexpected, which is to offer a modified defense of Wittgenstein. I think that there's more of a continuity, perhaps you're relying, between the sort of mini-ceremonies that Wittgenstein is concerned with in the text you were referring to, and the sorts which Van Gennep discusses in Rite de Passage. And it's this. So think of something as cost-free as saying grace at the beginning and the end of a meal. Now that I think is the sort of mini-ceremony that Wittgenstein has in mind as paradigmatic. And you may say, well, look, it's not marking a transition in life in the way that a wedding is. And of course that's true. But I think it is taking people out of the everyday in something like the same way. That's to say, we're going to stop ordinary business. We're going to have a meal, which is, as anthropologists will tell you, is not just a matter of eating. Animals eat. They do not have meals. And we're going to go into a space where certain rules apply about what you can talk about. And at the end, we're going to go back to ordinary ways. So I don't quite see that there's as much discontinuity as you may be suggesting between the sort of ceremony, the mini-ceremony that Wittgenstein's concerned with, and the commonality between that and the sort of more lavish ceremony that Van Gennep majors in that extraordinary book. Yeah.
Fantastic for both comments. So I'm a great admirer of Martin Hollis. I had forgotten that he was one of the contributors to the Rationality and Relativism, one of the major contributors. I looked a little bit there. They were interested in different things to me, but I need to go back to that. So thank you very much for that and the whole debate. Yeah, so that's a very interesting example of saying grace, because I wouldn't have read it the way you did, but you're right. So I think that is a liminal space. And I'm very happy to concede there's a type of continuum of ceremonies from the very, very lavish to the smallest ritual. Maybe even the smallest ritual has a type of liminal space as part of it, taking you out the everyday. And maybe even there, that is an epistemology of value, but maybe very personal, in that case, rather than social value. So thank you. Yeah, I will definitely take that into account.
Forgive the pun. This might seem a left field question, but all through your talk, I kept thinking, what could I think of areas where eggheads who've taught me were deeply committed to ceremonies and rituals? And I kept thinking of sport, the Olympics. So David Charles, who taught me, spent as much time talking about rugby as he did about philosophy. Steve Williams, who I'm seeing tomorrow, we used to talk about Leeds United. Mike Brearley has written extraordinary things. And I wondered, how does sport fit in with ceremony and ritual? And it's the most ubiquitous of activities. It also hits on some of your questions about nationalism. Roger Scruton on fox hunting. It seems to me there's a whole area of literature, of ceremony and ritual that pertains to what you're talking about that's not here. But how would the Olympics fit into your...
So, fascinating. So I have to confess I haven't considered sport, but the point that comes to my mind is when I'm watching the World Cup final and it's over, I turn it off before the award of the medals. Right? So I don't know if these people would have stayed for the medal ceremony. And the opening ceremony for the Olympic Games would be a very good test point. Of who really made a point of wanting to watch. And of course, people like us will say, well, it was all about the NHS. That's why we're watching it. But yeah, I can remember talking to a philosopher who said he cried when he saw parades. It was like an involuntary reflex, and other people say, yeah, that happens to me. And my eyes are pretty dry at parade. They're wet at other things, but not at parades. So I do think there is a difference between this sort of psychological response people have. But sport is really interesting. And it may be a type of sort of almost sublimated or repressed avenue for ceremony and groups. And being in a crowd is, in a football crowd, say, has many of the same features. So anyway, thank you for that. Nothing more to say, but I will give it some more thought.
Thank you, Joe. That was very stimulating. I have a suggestion for your reading list of philosophers and then a potential criticism of one thing you said. The suggestion is the Epicureans. So they famously set up, celebrations around a day to commemorate, I can't remember whether it was his birth or his death, of Epicurus. And when I first read that, I thought, how strange for a bunch of avowed eggheads. They were quite rationalistic in their understanding of nature and of human life. But thanks to your talk, I think I do understand what they were after. They were after a kind of collective affirmation of particular values and sharing it. So anyway, there is a philosophical tradition there. And the potential criticism is the mere fact that, for example, a poor person or anyone else feels compelled by social norms to have great expenditure on, say, a wedding or a funeral, doesn't mean that they themselves see great value in it. Or that because we can all be locked in a bad equilibrium in which social norms dictate something and we are all punished, and in fact we will continue to punish others because if we don't punish them, we will in turn be punished for being nonconformists. Human beings are very, can be locked in that way. Now, sometimes, of course, we can have rituals that do have positive value, and therefore the social reinforcement is important, but you should consider the potential for bad equilibria as well as good ones.
I've got 3 lines in my paper which I didn't read out, which doesn't address that, but it comes close to addressing it, which is that So I accept the point that some people could be doing it for social pressure. What I thought was that still showed the values of the group. It's just that your individual values may not fit with it. But you're suggesting it could be something else, that there's a bad equilibrium and it's, no one really wants to do it, you just have to. I think the giving of party bags at children's parties is an example of that, where there's a bad equilibrium. And we really need to abolish this practice, but no one knows how to, because we're talking about 25 years ago, where there was significant inflation. I'm sure it's gone on much worse ever since then. So I do agree that there can be the bad equilibria. So it's not a proof. The fact that people are prepared to give up a lot is not a proof. That you would need to do some more sensitive studies to understand what people's motivations are. But I would think it's very unlikely that everyone is doing this because they're trapped in a bad equilibrium. I think maybe a lot of the expense is a bad equilibrium, but the celebration of it is still seen as valuable. So, yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you and good evening. I wanted to ask you about a concept which was very briefly touched on by the previous questioner, the concept of conformity or conformism, which I don't think you mentioned, but which perhaps I might suggest underlies a lot of what you were saying. And isn't it the case that in every society there needs to be a balance between a level of conformism without which society couldn't function, but at the same time, whatever the opposite of perhaps non-conformism as well. That's the underlying tension which from which your discussion arises. Ceremonies on the whole perhaps reinforce conformism, maybe not always, but often, and eggheads maybe introduce a necessary element of dissent. I'm sitting here with some legal colleagues, and in the law there are many ceremonies, but at the same time I think many of us recognize that valuable though conformism is, necessary in fact for the system to work, it's a jolly good idea to have some dissentients around.
Very good. Thank you. Yes, so you're right that tension is, I suppose, driving the paper. You put it better than I did. I mean, the way I thought of this, I think the closest I got was thinking of ceremonies as cutting off the revaluation of values, because ceremonies give this type of charge to the values that make them very difficult to challenge. And you become a rebel, an outsider, if you challenge that, even when the values need to be challenged or should be challenged. So getting that balance right between the continuity you need just to keep things going. Because the side of that, I suppose I didn't see it so much as the need to keep things going, though that may well be right. But what I thought was valuable is this idea that there can be times of great stress where it's very easy to forget what's important. And if you've got a tradition of ceremonies, that will bring us back to our values, even when they're inconvenient and even when we could be doing other things. So I think ceremonies can hold those values together. And maybe that is just another way of thinking about what you're saying about the importance of continuity. So thank you.
Thanks. I enjoyed that a lot. A lot of your work is quite sort of interdisciplinary, or at least interdisciplinary for a philosopher. And so it was interesting to hear the way you structured the papers, as if there's a lot being written on this outside of philosophy, thousands and thousands of papers, very little inside philosophy. And you spent most of the time sort of focusing on what philosophers had said about it. And I wondered why, almost what it is to do philosophy well, whether won't it just be often that, well, a lot of really, really good stuff has been written by other philosophers, and what we need to do is build on that rather than, as it were, look at the small fragments that philosophers have said about it and assume that's going to be better and more worthy of our attention than the things that Durkheim or other sort of enormous figures within other disciplines have said.
Okay, so I think that might be the first time I've ever been accused of putting too much philosophy into a paper. I normally get the exact opposite criticism. So I suppose what I would say, I took inspiration from Monica Wilson, who's an anthropologist, on that idea that ceremonies show us what we value, show society what we value, and also the neuroscience. It is true, I could have written the paper without mentioning Wolff or Kiechers, because they're making points that's in the other literature. They're not making very original points, but they are making it in a language which is more familiar to philosophers. The points from Habermas are more philosophical, I think. Yeah, it's a good question about the balance. I don't know if I've got any more to say about that. I thought I gave non-philosophical disciplines quite a good run in this paper on the whole.
As often with your work, it maybe reflect about the nature of philosophy, what it is to do it well, and how and why it is that philosophy needs to draw on disciplines other than itself. Thinking back to how the institute itself was set up 100 years ago with a wide range of disciplines and captains of industry, and how we could work together better, perhaps.
Thank you.
So I'll try to make this as coherent as possible. I was wanting to go back to the nationalism because it felt to me that having it structured by the right is a problem that can't be solved by ceremonies, because the ceremonies may not have enough content, and part of what we're concerned about is the content of what's good about nationalism. So I wasn't sure that ceremonies would do the job. Sorry, that sounds really aggressive. It didn't. It's not meant to.
You call that aggressive? You ought to go to the other philosophy societies. No, so I went very quickly at the end and probably wasn't very clear. So I don't think ceremonies are going to be the alternative to nationalism. I think ceremonies are an epistemology of value, of group value, and they will help us understand the values that could be counters to nationalism. At the same time, I'm not completely naive about this, because I understand nationalism has a type of mobilization, it has force, it has armies. A chess club doesn't. But if we're thinking about what is going to give value to people's lives, it's very often the local things rather than the national. And if what people are looking for in nationalism is a collective identity, I'm hoping we can use ceremonies as a way of thinking about alternative forms of collective identity. So it's the collective identity that's doing the work rather than the ceremonies.
Okay, I hope some of us are thirsty. Before we go down, I want to end by thanking just a few people. I want to thank Joe and Onora. And a huge thanks to the team who organised this event, in particular Melanie, Anissa, Beatrice, and the amazing team of volunteers they've got together. So thanks very much to them.